It had been one of those long shifts that made a man question every life choice leading to becoming an intergalactic mechanic. The kind of day where fixing the plasma conduit of a freighter felt like wrestling a radioactive snake while covered in lubricants that smelled like burnt socks, and after hours of twisting bolts, welding joints, and banging stubborn panels with the universal solution of hitting it harder, I found myself too tired to even drag my carcass back to my quarters, so I just collapsed on the padded bench in my workshop with my trusty hydrospanner clutched loosely in my hand and balanced across my lap, the metallic shaft glinting under the dim workshop lights like some sort of holy relic of grease-stained engineering glory. And because I was a human idiot who thought 2 minutes of resting his eyes would not turn into a full-blown nap, I snored myself into oblivion still in the same position, legs spread, jumpsuit unzipped halfway because space gets hot and sweaty. When you've been inside a fusion core chamber, and the hydrospanner resting proudly like some symbolic trophy right over the most suggestive part of my anatomy, because of course fate loves setting up situations that will later require emotional damage control. Now, in my defense, I did not expect anyone to walk in because the crew had already gone into downtime mode and the only person who ever came to my workshop after hours was the maintenance droid who gave exactly 0 shits about whether I was drooling on a wrench or dead from exhaustion. But today the universe had other plans, and those plans involved the newest hire on the ship, an alien-made species whose name sounded like someone choking on alphabet soup but who everyone just called Nala. Because we were lazy and had a collective allergy to syllables, and Nala was from a race that was very big on order and cleanliness, which meant she had made it her personal crusade to wipe every oil smear from my sanctified kingdom of grime no matter how many times I told her that the mess was part of the artistic process of fixing ships. So naturally the one time I left the place in what I considered a beautiful chaos of tools, bolts, and open panels, she decided to waltz in and conduct a deep cleaning intervention like some alien Marie Kondo on steroids. Meanwhile, I was in dreamland, happily oblivious, probably dreaming about winning the galactic lottery or finally getting a coffee machine that didn't spit out something that tasted like recycled sock water, and I only vaguely shifted when the door hissed open and a faint melodic hum floated into the room, which I later realized was Nala singing some alien cleaning mantra about purity and order. And then there was the soft sound of her footsteps as she glided inside, her 4 delicate limbs moving in perfect synchronization like some elegant spider ballet dancer, and she froze mid-step because her huge iridescent eyes locked onto the sight of me sprawled like a corpse in a very compromising tableau, with my legs apart, jumpsuit undone to the waist exposing a sweaty chest, and that long, shiny hydrospanner lying boldly across my groin like the galaxy's least subtle euphemism. Now, Nala had been on the ship for barely a week, which meant her entire education about humans came from a half-assed orientation video and whatever gossip she overheard in the crew mess. So in that split second of seeing me asleep with a tool that looked suspiciously phallic resting on my lap, her alien brain probably started connecting dots that didn't exist and drawing conclusions that were so far from the truth they needed a warp drive to return to reality, and to make matters worse, her species had some very strict taboos about exposing personal implements of reproduction, which meant that to her, this entire scene looked like I had decided to perform some kinky fertility ritual right in the middle of the engine bay, and instead of quietly backing out like any sane person, she stood there frozen, mandibles twitching in a way I later learned was the alien equivalent of blushing, and her head tilted slightly as she tried to process whether to report me for indecent exposure or to take notes on this bizarre human courtship display. The silence stretched, the only sounds were the soft hum of the ship and my snoring, which probably didn't help because apparently my snoring frequency matched the mating call of a small predator species in her homeworld. And at this point her curiosity got the better of her, so she stepped closer, her cleaning implements clinking softly like surgical instruments, her massive eyes reflecting the light in a way that made her look like an oversized, horny dragonfly, and she leaned down to inspect the hydrospanner with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, her mind no doubt spinning with thoughts like why does the human keep his mating implement so polished? And why is it resting in such a provocative position? And does he expect me to acknowledge this bold invitation, or is it some kind of dominance display to claim territory because if so it's working? Nala crouched slightly, her joints making that soft chime sound they always did when she bent, and she extended one of her slender upper limbs toward the gleaming shaft balanced across my lap, her fingers hovering just a breath away from the metal like she was about to perform some sacred ritual, and in her head, which I can only reconstruct later from the avalanche of questions she threw at me after the fact. She was absolutely convinced that she had stumbled onto some deeply private human custom, something so intimate and ceremonial that only the most bonded pairs were supposed to witness it. And the fact that I was displaying it so openly in a shared workspace told her either I was making a public declaration of readiness to mate or that humans were just that shameless. And knowing what she'd heard about us during crew gossip, she was leaning heavily toward the latter. She tilted her head and studied every curve and contour of the hydrospanner, the elongated handle, the adjustable jaw at the end that gleamed with traces of lubricant, and the little calibration markings that to her probably looked like some coded fertility sigil, and she whispered something in her language that sounded like a cross between a flute solo and a hiccup, which probably translated to something like, by the sacred silk of the broodmother, that is enormous, because her species apparently had a whole lexicon for measuring appendages, and while I lay there oblivious and snoring, she reached out with two of her lower arms and carefully lifted the tool from my lap like it was an ancient relic, her eyes widening when it shifted slightly because she mistook the weight and balance for some sort of responsive biological property, and then she held it up in the dim light and turned it over slowly, completely mesmerized. Now, in her culture, objects associated with mating rituals were never shared casually. They were kept in sealed sanctuaries and handled only by partners during extremely formal ceremonies that involved candles, pheromone vapors, and a choir of juvenile hatchlings humming the ancestral tones. So the idea that I had just left mine lying around like a paperweight sent her logic circuits into a tailspin, and she decided right then that this explained everything the crew said about humans being bold, impulsive, and dangerously passionate, and her curiosity bloomed into something that made her mandibles click nervously. Which was probably her body's way of saying I'm intrigued but also terrified and slightly turned on. She brought the hydrospanner closer to her face and sniffed it, because apparently that's how her species verified authenticity, and the mix of machine oil, sweat, and ozone hit her scent receptors like a punch of raw masculinity, and suddenly her lower limbs wobbled like she had just inhaled the alien equivalent of tequila fumes. And now she was locked into a feedback loop where the more she observed, the more questions she had, and the more questions she had, the more she felt compelled to poke and prod until answers spilled out like a broken fuel line. So she reached down with her other set of arms and gently touched the zipper of my jumpsuit because she assumed that if the external implement was this impressive, then whatever biological mechanism powered it must be hidden underneath some sort of ceremonial sheath, and she began to slowly tug it lower, pausing every few millimeters like a thief trying not to trigger an alarm, her enormous eyes darting between the zipper and my face as I continued to snore in complete innocence, dreaming about universal peace or maybe fried chicken, who knows, and she exposed a little more of my chest, which to her was probably scandalous because her species didn't do body hair, and now she was staring at a sweaty pelt of man fur that gleamed under the low lights like some wild beast had been trapped in a cloth cage. This did not deter her, it only made her more convinced that she was unraveling some grand evolutionary mystery, because what kind of species grew a secondary mating display across their thorax like that? And did I use it to intimidate rivals or attract partners? And how much oil did it take to keep the whole system functional? And as these thoughts spiraled through her overactive brain, she absent-mindedly started stroking the hydrospanner's handle with slow, deliberate motions, her delicate digits sliding along its length as if trying to memorize every ridge and groove, and she made a soft humming sound deep in her thoracic cavity that would have raised alarm bells in anyone familiar with her species' courtship signals, but luckily for both of us I was still dead to the world, mouth open, drool pooling near my ear like a disgusting halo of blissful ignorance. Then came the real turning point, the moment that would etch itself into the archives of ship gossip for all eternity, because Nala decided that simply observing the implement was no longer enough. She needed to test its function, and in her mind that meant finding out whether it responded to environmental stimuli. So she did what any rational alien maid would do when confronted with an alien's mysterious mating artifact. She pressed the little adjustment dial near the head, and when the jaws clicked open and closed with a satisfying metallic snap, she let out a high-pitched trill that could have shattered glass, because in her mind the thing had just winked at her. And now she was convinced beyond all doubt that the rumors were true, that humans possessed detachable mating organs capable of transforming shape on command, and that I was either the bravest or the most reckless male in the galaxy for falling asleep in such a vulnerable state while armed with something so obviously potent. Her breathing quickened, her mandibles quivered, and she leaned closer, practically nose to metal now, whispering something that sounded like glorious mechanism of virility in her native tongue. And then she did the one thing that would have launched this entire situation straight past awkward and into the uncharted nebula of catastrophic misunderstanding. She pressed the hydrospanner against her own abdomen like she was testing compatibility, and when the cool metal touched her exoskeleton, she shuddered and let out another sound that was half gasp, half war cry, which must have echoed through the maintenance bay like the call of a deranged mating bird. And that was the exact second my brain decided to crawl out of dreamland and slam headfirst into the waking nightmare of reality. The first thing that registered was the sound, a strange high-pitched trill that didn't belong in my workshop, not unless someone had installed a smoke detector that had fallen in love, and then came the sensation. A weird metallic clink against my thigh followed by a gentle pressure like something was balancing on me, and my brain clawed its way out of sleep with all the grace of a drunk sloth, my eyelids dragging open to reveal the dim glow of the overhead lights and, more importantly, the enormous iridescent eyes of Nala staring down at me from way too close for comfort, her face filling my entire field of vision like an alien jump scare from a horror Hollywood. And for a split second I thought I had died and some insectoid goddess had come to escort me to the afterlife, but then reality hit and reality was worse. Because there she was, the ship's brand new maid, crouched over me like a crime scene investigator who had decided to get personal, with all four of her elegant limbs wrapped around something shiny that I quickly recognized as my hydrospanner, which she was currently pressing against her own abdomen with an expression that could only be described as reverent ecstasy, and that was when my survival instincts kicked in and I made the worst possible sound, a confused grunt halfway between a question and a burp, which startled her so much that she let out another trill that sounded like a synthesizer having an emotional breakdown and dropped the tool straight onto my groin with a metallic thump that made me see the birth of the universe in vivid detail. I jerked upright with a gasp that could have powered a small wind turbine, clutching the hydrospanner like it was a lifeline, and Nala skittered back a few steps, all four arms raised in what I assumed was a defensive posture but which also made her look like she was about to perform interpretive dance. And I croaked out something that vaguely resembled what the hell while trying not to pass out from the pain in my most sacred region, and she immediately launched into a flurry of melodic alien syllables that probably translated to "Oh sacred broodmother, forgive me, I didn't mean to desecrate the ritual," because she kept bowing her head and gesturing toward the hydrospanner like it was the Ark of the Covenant. When my brain finally rebooted enough to string together coherent English, I managed to wheeze out, "What are you doing with my tool?" And the instant the words left my mouth I realized the universe had a sense of humor because her antennae perked up and her mandibles clicked in a rhythm that was definitely not neutral, and she repeated the word tool slowly like it was the key to enlightenment, and then she tilted her head and said in her halting, heavily accented basic, "You display so openly, great implement of union." And I swear to every deity in the cosmos that my soul tried to eject from my body right then and there because suddenly I understood exactly what she thought she had walked in on, and it was so catastrophically wrong I didn't even know where to start fixing it. No, it's not. This isn't. Oh my God, I stammered, waving my hands like that would somehow erase the last 10 minutes from both our memories, but she kept inching closer, her enormous eyes glowing with some kind of curious reverence, and she extended one slender limb to gently tap the hydrospanner now clutched against my chest, and she whispered, "It changes shape." Because of course she had fiddled with the adjustment dial, and I wanted to dig a hole in the bulkhead and launch myself into the vacuum of space. "It's a wrench," I blurted out, which didn't help at all because she just repeated the word like it was some exotic mating title, and then she said, "Is detachable organ? You sleep with it, for strength?" For invitation, and I swear my brain blue screen because how do you even begin to explain the concept of mechanical tools to someone who thinks they've just witnessed a fertility display? And before I could form a single sensible sentence she leaned in closer until her face was inches from mine and asked in the most earnest tone imaginable, "Does it choose me?" I choked so hard I nearly swallowed my tongue, sputtering like an engine with sand in the intake, and all I could manage was a strangled "what?" But she took my confusion as hesitation and pressed on, her mandibles clicking in what I later learned was a sign of nervous excitement, and she said, "If I accept, do we bind, brood clan?" And at that point I had two options, explain the misunderstanding calmly and rationally, or completely lose my composure and sound like a deranged primate. And guess which one I picked, because the next thing out of my mouth was, "It's a goddamn wrench, Nala, it's for bolts, not babies." She froze, her antennae stiffening like someone had just cut the music at an alien rave, and she stared at me with those massive reflective eyes for a full 5 seconds before letting out a confused little chirp and saying, "Bolts, babies, same," which almost made me cry, because how do you teach mechanical engineering terminology to someone whose entire worldview revolves around egg clutches and pheromone exchanges? And so I tried again, holding up the hydrospanner like a prop in the world's most awkward educational video and babbling, "This is a tool, okay? For fixing ships, for tightening things, not for, look, humans don't do whatever you think this is." And she blinked slowly, her mandibles twitching like she was downloading a cultural update and finding half the files corrupted. Finally she said, in that careful voice people use when they think they've misunderstood but aren't entirely convinced, "So, humans do not offer implements to signal readiness?" And I threw my head back and groaned like a dying walrus, because I knew that no matter how many times I explained this, the story was already carved in stone in her mind, and probably in the crew gossip network within the hour. And when I looked back at her, she was still staring at the hydrospanner with something that was definitely not academic interest, and I realized with bone-deep dread that this conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. I sat there gripping the hydrospanner like it was a hostage while Nala loomed over me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious visions. And the worst part was she still looked unconvinced, like she thought I was just playing coy with some sacred mating protocol, and my brain was screaming for a way out, because how do you dismantle an entire cultural misunderstanding that's already spiraling into interspecies engagement territory? So I tried the direct approach and said, slowly and clearly, "It is a tool for repairs, nothing else." But instead of nodding and apologizing like a sane person, she tilted her head and asked, "Then, why guard it while sleeping?" And that question hit me like a slap, because I realized that from her perspective, it did look insane, me sprawled out with a shiny metal object positioned like an erotic centerpiece, and I could feel my face turning the color of a reactor meltdown as I babbled something about being too tired to put it away and accidentally falling asleep. But she was already shaking her head and clicking her mandibles like a disapproving schoolteacher, and then she said the one sentence that nearly stopped my heart, "If you did not wish to share, why invite display?" At that point I gave up on language entirely and resorted to wild hand gestures that probably looked like a territorial dance, waving the wrench and pointing at the ship like I was auditioning for interpretive engineering theater, shouting things like bolts, screws, not breeding sticks. And she just stood there calmly absorbing my meltdown with the serene patience of someone convinced they're dealing with a species that has primitive communication skills. And then she took one slow step closer and said in a low, almost sultry tone, "Human, always armed, even in rest. Very strong." And that, right there, was the moment I realized I was never living this down, because no matter what clarification I offered, she had already decided that humans were some kind of hyper-aggressive, permanently aroused warrior species that slept with weapons of passion strapped to their hips. And when she reached out one elegant limb and gently pushed the hydrospanner back toward my lap like she was returning a lover's token, I knew words had officially lost the war, so I just sat there frozen, while she chirped something that sounded like a blessing and then turned on all four heels and glided out of the workshop, leaving me alone with my shame, my sweaty jumpsuit, and the dawning horror of what would happen once she told literally everyone on this ship about what she thought she saw. I spent the next 20 minutes pacing the workshop in a panic spiral, clutching the hydrospanner like a talisman and muttering, just a wrench under my breath, like that would somehow rewrite reality. And when I finally worked up the nerve to venture out, I realized it was already too late, because every single crew member I passed in the corridor gave me the same look, that knowing smirk mixed with mild fear, and one guy even gave me a thumbs up and said, "Didn't know you were packing torque like that, Chief." And I wanted to fling myself out an airlock, because the only way that line made sense was if Nala had skipped straight to the part where humans apparently duel with detachable mating rods for dominance. By the time I made it to the mess hall, the rumor had evolved into a full-blown cultural myth, because I overheard two engineers whispering about how humans consecrate their tools by sleeping with them, and how that explains why we're so good at improvising in emergencies. Because apparently it's not training or ingenuity, it's just that we bond spiritually with our implements through erotic nap rituals. And when they saw me standing there, they both straightened like cadets in front of a drill. Sergeant, and muttered something about respecting this sacred union, and that was when I knew I had two choices: deny everything and sound guilty as hell, or lean into the insanity and turn this into a win for the human brand. So I grabbed a coffee, slammed it back like a shot of liquid courage, marched up to the nearest cluster of wide-eyed aliens, and said in the most gravelly voice I could muster, "Yeah, humans sleep armed. Always ready. You never know when the universe is gonna throw a loose bolt at you." And then I slapped the hydrospanner onto the table with a clang that echoed like a war drum. And the way their antennae and mandibles twitched, you'd think I'd just dropped the crown jewels. And from that moment on, the legend solidified like epoxy. Humans don't just fix ships, we tame them in our sleep. And our mating implements double as weapons because we're just that efficient. Nala, of course, became my biggest fan overnight, flitting around like an acolyte spreading the gospel of human virility and engineering prowess. And every time I walked into a room, she made this little chirping trill that I later learned was her species salute to alpha mates, which was mortifying until the perks started rolling in. Because suddenly nobody questioned my requisition forms, everyone gave me extra rations, and the captain himself pulled me aside and said, "Heard about your commitment to your craft. That's the kind of dedication we need," and I just nodded solemnly like a man carrying the burden of his people's reputation while internally screaming at the absurdity of it all. The real kicker came a week later during a diplomatic dinner when an alien ambassador asked if it was true that humans consecrate their tools before major endeavors, and before I could open my mouth, Nala piped up and said, "Yes. Human keep weapon of union close always. Even now." And suddenly every pair of eyes at that table was locked on my lap like I was smuggling a thermal detonator, and I swear I've never clenched my thighs so hard in my life, but I just raised my glass and said, "What can I say? Humanity stays ready," and the room erupted in approving clicks and trills like I'd just declared war in the sexiest possible way. So now that's our reputation across 3 sectors: humans, the species that sleeps armed, mates with tools, and can apparently tighten your loose bolts in every sense of the phrase. And I'd love to tell you I corrected the misunderstanding, but honestly, after the discounts, the respect, and the sheer diplomatic leverage it gave us, I figured, why ruin a good thing? And if anyone asks, yeah, I sleep with my tool out, because that's what humans do.